Good morning and welcome back to the channel. It's been over a week, unheard of for me, since the last video. The last one was a compilation with a piece to camera leading in of my trip to Svalbard. But as per, well, what's the 12th today, 12th of May, time's pressing on. I'm just going to stop under the bough of this tree because I'm just about to walk into some bright sunlight and I think the reflections will be quite a lot. Anyway, welcome back to the channel. I think things are slowly coming back to what might be a different normal, but a form of normal. I'm out on the dog walk again. Today, what I wanted to talk about is ISO. International Standards Organization, I think it stands for, or to most photographers, it's the number we set in that matches our cameras to whatever film we have. There's a hark back to the past film. Anyway, I don't believe we need ISO. I think it's an unnecessary setting on the camera. I think there are very few people that need it and only an incredibly small number of special cases that require you to actually get more noise in an image rather than less. So from my perspective, I always take pictures with the lowest possible ISO I can get away with, whilst getting the depth of field and the shutter speed requirements that I want. So obviously, if you're into wildlife and nature photography, you're going to be doing that in a slightly different way. But as a landscape photographer, I really see little point having ISO on the camera as a setting. Let me explain further. In the past, the first cameras didn't have ISO on them. They just had film loaded in, or plates if you want to go far enough back, and you controlled the shutter speed and the aperture. In some cases completely manually. In the case of old cameras, box cameras and the likes, you actually held the shutter open manually for as long as it needed. But as cameras evolved and the ability to have the camera work out certain things, initially with just analog electronics in the sense of having physical sort of sensor in the camera, just measuring the light or on the camera, and then that would be used to alter the shutter speed or the aperture. And that's more or less as far as I can remember, and if you know better please correct me and put comments below, but from my distant dim memory of all of this, it was very much that the concept of a button, or at least a dial for ISO, came about because you needed a way of instructing the camera's rather crude metering system to match the film that you'd put in the camera. So if you had an ASA 400 film, relatively fast in its day, or 1000, an old, I think it was Agfa, I think they had 1000 black and white at one point. Names for sort of fail me a little bit, but dim and distant past, I think that was the case. And you used that simply as a way of making the metering system aware of how sensitive the film was in the camera. Hence the reason ISO, because the actual films were rated in ISO ratings. So that's a little bit of a potted brief history of how we ended up with ISO. But nowadays our cameras are much cleverer. They've got computers in, and they've got artificial intelligence in some cases. So the result of that is our cameras are using a concept that doesn't exist. We don't have film in the camera at all. We have a sensor, which is analogous to a film, I suppose. Now, I'm purporting that, or at least my theory is that we don't need ISO in our cameras any longer as a setting, because what we need to do is, I always have my camera set on pretty much most of the time on ISO auto, and I'm either in aperture priority mode, or I'm in shutter speed priority mode if it's action, or I'm in full manual. And if I'm in full manual, I'm deciding what shutter speed I want to achieve an effect, for instance getting motion blur deliberately, that sort of thing, and I'm deciding how much depth of field I want in the image. And there is no way on the face of the planet that I would ever consider setting deliberately a high ISO specifically to ensure that I got grain in the image. I want the minimum amount of grain in the image, and if I want grain in the image anyway, I can always add it later in post-processing using Photoshop or other tools like it. So really it's redundant. Setting it on auto will give me the best ISO, the lowest in that definition, the lowest ISO that I'm going to be able to have to meet the shutter speed and the aperture that I've set up. Now if I'm in aperture priority mode, the shutter speed will float around to suit if necessary, but the ISO will also float around as well. I'm not sure quite what the relationship between the two is. I haven't calculated or worked that out. And equally, if I'm in shutter speed mode, the aperture will float around as well as the ISO to actually achieve a reasonably balanced image. So interesting concept then. Manual mode, automatic ISO, and as the photographer I choose the two settings I want. In some ways that's almost like going back to the original days of film, but it just takes the question mark over whether you get a decently exposed image or not out of the question, because the ISO being auto will float to a point that you get an image that works. Grainy or not grainy, it'll still be a reasonably well exposed image. So I'm going to take some shots today on this walk at different ISOs, and I'm going to use ISO auto in different situations and see really the images that I get, whether it's necessary to have ISO at all and just leave it on auto. So let's see how we get on with that. Sorry about waffling on for so long. I've had over a week of waffling, so you're all getting it now. Well, I've been messing around with the camera as I've been walking, and I found some quite interesting things out about my Sony, which I previously, to be honest, didn't know. I suspected it might behave in the way it was behaving, but I've actually seen behaviour as well that I didn't expect. So what I'm going to do, as I don't have a tripod with me, is I'm going to nip home, set the camera up on a tripod in the back garden, and I'll talk you through the things that I was seeing. It's quite interesting actually. I'll see you in a minute. Okay, I'm back from the dog walk and I've set up in the garden here. I'm just sat in the shade of one of the trees because it's a bit bright. So what I've done is I've set the camera up here and it's pointing in the corner into a tree in the distance on the far corner of the garden. It's not an interesting picture in its own right, it's just to demonstrate exactly what the camera's going to do in terms of ISO. So I'll move you around and you can see what I'm seeing on the back of the camera. Okay, so I've got the camera set up here and you're viewing what I'm seeing. I'm in manual mode, so I've got ISO on automatic as you'd expect, as we're discussing the whole concept of ISO, and it says down here ISO auto. It doesn't show you the ISO it's actually going to use until I'd half depress the shutter, and you can see it says here at the moment that at a 1/25th of a second f13 it's going to use ISO 1600. Now with the finger half depressing the shutter like this, if I move the shutter speed, you'll see that the ISO is changing. It's going down because I'm increasing the shutter speed, and you can see that it's a 10th at the moment, 8th, 6th, and we're starting to get blown out highlights coming in. The picture's getting brighter because it's at ISO 100 and it's flashing to say it can't go lower than it wants to. So if I increase the shutter speed up to the point it doesn't flash, it stopped flashing at an 8th. So basically that's saying that in manual mode, 1/8 of a second f13 is going to expose this at ISO 100. If I subsequently wind the the shutter speed up, you can see at a 200th of a second at f13 I've got ISO 2000. So manual mode clearly does exactly what you'd expect, dependent whether you alter the shutter or the aperture. The ISO just floats to make that happen. And when it can't make it happen because it can't go high enough or can't go low enough, the ISO on my particular Sony starts flashing. So the next thing I'll do is I'll move it over into shutter speed mode. Now it still says ISO auto and it still says 200th of a second, so I can alter the shutter speed here quite easily. And what you'll notice is that it can't, this is a 2.8 lens, so it can't go faster than 2.8. It can't close down or open up any more than that. So let's start at 3/50th of a second. It's saying 2.8 at 160 ISO, 2.8 500 250, 750 2.8 320, and so on and so forth. 1000 at 2.8 500, and as I go up more, 3000 2.8 1250. I go the other way, take the ISO down to 100. Now the aperture started flashing because it can't open the lens up anymore to 90th of a second to actually get enough light for ISO 100. So if I just increase the shutter speed until it stops flashing, and it says 2/50th of a second, 2.8 ISO 125, and that's now not flashing. So that is shutter speed mode working with ISO. What happens if I go right to the other end? It's 8,000th of a second ISO 4000 2.8. Okay, so that is shutter speed priority and how it operates. I'll put it in aperture priority and see the A's appeared at the top here. And I've got f13, and if I change the aperture down to 22, I've got 1600 4.5 at f22. So if I now change the aperture to 2.8, it's ISO 100 2/50th of a second, so clearly the shutter speed is being altered to match the aperture. And interestingly, I forgot to add, there is an interesting effect here. This is a zoom lens. I've got the 24-70 on here. I've got it in aperture priority mode, and I noticed when I was out on the walk an interesting effect, and I'll point it out now. The effect is that I've got a very small aperture set, f22, and at the moment it's at a 30th of a second ISO 500, and if I zoom, and I'm at 24mm approximately, as I zoom, notice the shutter speed is increasing and the ISO's matching that. So at 70mm it's giving me a 90th of a second, and at approximately 50mm it's giving me a 60th of a second, and at 35 it's giving 45, and at 24 it's giving 30. So in very, very broad terms, what that's doing is it's actually using the reciprocal rule of the focal length of the lens to make sure that the shutter speed is actually one over whatever that is. I know it's not quite 100% right, but you can see from zooming the lens that that's pretty much what it was doing. So it's obviously taking into account not only increasing the ISO or decreasing it as appropriate, it's also making sure that the minimum shutter speed that it's using matches up to the reciprocal rule or very close to it, so that if you're, in case of being on tripod, doesn't matter, but if I was handheld it would be attempting to make sure that I actually get shake-free shots. So it's just another little aside. I don't know if other people's cameras can do that, but this Sony certainly can, which is quite a nice little feature, I think. Well, thank you very much for watching that. I hope you found it informative. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and support it in that way. Thanks very much for watching.